Let's go back 25 years. Imagine a cold night near the end of December. Bitter wind blew straight off the sea, sending driving snow whirling about, blanketing the ground. Drifts, feet deep, formed against walls, buildings and the gravestones in the churchyard of St Hilda's. The rector of St Hilda's sat in his cosy study contemplating the merrily crackling fire. His pale eyes were fixed in the middle distance, his expression sour. He steepled his fingers together and sighed deeply as that cold, stern gaze drifted upwards to the ceiling. 2 stories up in a small chilly bedroom under the eaves, a young woman lay huddled in bed under blankets and quilts. She was cocooned in happiness. The smile on her face made her delicate features beautiful. She snuggled down further and hugged herself and her non-existent belly. The blizzard raged on outside as the rector rose stiffly. He threw a couple more logs on the fire, then left the room. Fast forward to last year, I was beginning to regret my decision about spending Christmas with me uncle. It was just a rash decision based on the pity I felt for the lonely old man. The seaside town where my uncle had been the former rector, as beautiful as it was prone to being cut off in the winter weather. I had no wish to stay beyond my planned 4-day visit, but I just wanted to see the old rectory again. It's a building of considerable historical interest and architectural beauty. And yeah, I was looking forward to spending time with an uncle who had always treated me kindly back in my youth. I knew he may not be the same following the death of his son, my cousin Daniel, 25 years ago, and his wife having died years previously. My uncle just threw himself into charitable duties with almost demonic zeal to the point that he just broke down. So then 6 months of convalescence in a retreat followed by a quiet retirement just about put him back together again. Look, I haven't even seen him in 5 years and I didn't realise just how much he had changed. After a warm welcome and a pleasant supper, I lay huddled up under blankets and eiderdowns in the cosy little attic room under the eaves. Snow thudded against the glass of the window, and as I was drifting off, I heard the door open softly. A young woman entered the room holding a candle, and she glided silently across the window. She ignored me completely and was staring intently out of the window with a look of intense concentration on her pretty face. She turned away from the window, her expression full beautiful with wistful hope, as she swiftly left the room in a swirl of skirts, closing the door quietly behind her. I felt no fear, and she was no way frightening, I was just mostly puzzled as to who she was, as there was only myself and my uncle in the building. And before I knew what was happening, sleep just overtook me. The following morning after breakfast, I raised the subject with my uncle. "This place," I said, "it's so old, is it haunted?" My uncle's pale blue eyes seemed to bulge out as he stared at me, and I swear his face turned a shade paler. He said, "It is old, many lives are lived out here and lost, but I've never seen anything." His gaze seemed to shift into the middle distance to the left of my head, and I turned to see what attracted his gaze, but saw nothing, except a large empty hall and staircase behind me. "No, nothing here at all," he said, and then visibly snapping back to the present, he said, "I have affairs to attend to this morning and you'll have to amuse yourself until lunchtime if that's all right." Before I could reply, he had turned and hurried into his study and closed the door firmly behind him. That was a little bit uncomfortable, and as he's doing his own thing, I thought I'll just go out for a nice walk in the snow around the churchyard to pay my respects at my cousin Daniel's grave. With Daniel, from what I was told, he had some sort of seizure and had fallen down the stairs, breaking his neck about 25 years ago. The rest of my family at the time were amazed how my uncle could bear to remain in this house after such a tragedy. Anyway, I entered the churchyard and trudged slowly through thick snow to the north side facing the sea. Ahead of me, I could just make out a slim figure, bundled up against the cold, limping between the headstones. Whoever it was, they appeared to be heading in the same direction as I was. The figure stopped about 30 yards away, crouched down and seemed to be brushing snow from one of the stones. As I made my way over, I lost sight of the figure being obscured by tall stones and monuments, and then I realised it had been my cousin's grave where they'd been. By the time I got there, the figure was now on the far side of the graveyard, disappearing from view. The snow had been brushed off Daniel's headstone, visibly prominent as all the others were semi-submerged in white drifts. After spending a good while contemplating my grief over losing Daniel, then wondering who the other person was, I turned and started to trudge back for lunch. Something wasn't right, but I could not put my finger on it. It was only after I got back I realised my entire walk had been through unblemished virgin snow. There was no footprints around apart from mine. From then onwards, my uncle seemed distracted and he was unable to finish his sentences. He would drift off halfway through a conversation. It took some effort to get him to go to midnight mass the following evening. Wrapped up nice and warm against the cold, we headed out and settled in a quiet pew at the back of the church, as my uncle was in no fit state to interact with his former parishioners. The church was lit only by candlelight, throwing dark shadows in all directions. As the service droned on, a slight movement to my right caught my attention. A figure, a woman, limped from one shadow to the next, then silently made her way to the top of the stairs that led down to the disused crypt. She paused and turned to look over her shoulder and stared directly at me. I stared back in shock recognition. There was no mistake, it was the same pretty girl I had seen in my room that first night. So I turned back to my uncle to see him staring as well, and I said, "You see her? Who is she?"
"Nothing, I see nothing,"
he stammered in a whisper. I turned back just in time to see her disappearing down the stairs, so quickly, snatching up a thick white candle from the aisle, I set off in pursuit. I carefully crept down the uneven stairs, confident I was going to get to the bottom of all this. The only other exit to the crypt was a small door which had been locked, sealed shut for decades. So I knew there was no way out other than the stairs that I was walking down. As I descended the final steps, I raised the candle high for maximum illumination, and there was nothing else alive down there. The small crypt was completely bare apart from the patchwork of ledger stones set in the floor. I'm telling you now, there was no hiding place, not even for a mouse to hide, let alone a person. My heart was racing. I took the stairs 2 at a time to go back to my uncle, fighting the panic that I felt. And when I got to the top, I found a little knot of parishioners gathered around my uncle, who seemed to have collapsed. One of them said to me, "I think he's overtired, better get him home." Well, I just about managed to get him back to the house and to the warmth of the study. One large brandy later, I did see some colour return to his face. Now it's time I needed some answers. "Did you see her?" He shook his head frantically like a child in denial. I crouched down in front of him, trying my best not to be too aggressive. I said, "Did you see her?"
No.
I asked him again, "Did you see her?"
Yes, I did.
He seemed to explode, and then his voice dropped to a whisper.
"I see her every day. She's never left, and neither has he."
My blood turned to ice in my veins. "What exactly do you mean?" He stared at me with a directness and coherence I hadn't seen for days.
"Daniel did not have an accident. I know that's what everyone has told you, but no. There was no seizure, no fall down the stairs. Daniel hung himself from the landing in the hall. I managed to cover it up, but I could not face the scandal, but he is still there. I see his corpse hanging in the hall every time I enter. Oh no, there he is, look."
At those words I spun around to the open study door, and before my very eyes a figure seemed to move out from the darkness. Framed by the open doorway I could see a pair of legs. In utter disbelief as I walked slowly forward, more of the hanging figure came into view, until I could see my cousin Daniel's black and distorted face staring lifeless down at me through clouded eyes. The rope around his neck creaked softly, breaking the silence. I jumped as my uncle came up behind me and spoke softly, almost so not to disturb the hanging corpse.
Impetuous boy, so passionate, I had to do something. Something to stop himself throwing away such a bright, bright future. And you know, he was all set to leave Oxford with first-class honours, you know. The world would have been his oyster. And then during the summer months before his final year, something that would have ruined his life, it all happened. He became infatuated, thought himself in love with the new maid. A pretty lively little thing, I'll grant you, always singing, always dancing, but no, I could not let that happen. They went behind my back, you know. I only found out after he returned for his final year of study. I accidentally intercepted a letter from him to her, and then after that I made sure I intercepted every single one. I know it was underhand and dishonest. I'm not proud of what I did, you know, but I had to. I had no choice. When I discovered their final plans to get married, I had to stop it. I thought I could reason with the girl. Surely if she loved him, she would not want to ruin his future. She would let him go. I hatched a plan for a secret rendezvous to persuade her to leave him and go far away. I was even prepared to pay generously. I'm not so unkind. The church was due to close Christmas Eve for 3 months due to structural work, so I could guarantee privacy. I faked a letter from Daniel, and my writing was very close to his, and I named the church crypt as the place to meet him on Christmas Eve to elope. And Daniel was staying at university for the Christmas break to study for finals, so I sent the letter. And the deception worked perfectly as I saw her slipping out of the side gate and head down towards the church.
At this point, my uncle's recently restored composure began to crumble.
She wouldn't listen. She refused outright to all my requests, and she was going to ruin his life. I had to shake some sense into her. I did not mean it to happen. It was an accident. The floor of the crypt was covered in debris, tools, chains. A couple of the tombstones had been lifted. Gaping black holes, and she wrenched herself from my grasp and stumbled away from me, and her legs tangling in some old chains, and then she tumbled backwards into an open tomb. I remember her head cracking on the edge with a sickening loud thump as she fell. And those chains followed her down with a crash. Then the solution suddenly presented itself. The girl was dead, and the blood pool about her head had me in no doubt. Her legs tangled in the chains that had been twisted at an unnatural angle, having snagged on an iron bracket on the way down. I moved the ledger stone back over the gaping hole, sealing it up tight. I snuffed out all of the candles and locked the church up securely in preparation for the external structural work that was due to take place later on in the new year. Oh, Daniel.
I didn't take my eyes off him. His eyes drifted over to the silent hanging figure in the hall, and then he continued. His heart broke on the learning of her disappearance. I convinced him of her total abandonment and that she ran away with another man. He took his own life 3 days later, and he has not left me since. I was standing there in disbelief. What about the girl? I asked. Oh, she is still here too, limping about. She is a daily reminder of my sins. She is my punishment and penance. I had to stay here to atone, you see, and I couldn't bear to leave Daniel, but it
broke me in the end.
No, you don't understand what I'm saying. What about the girl? Is she still in the crypt? Did you leave her there?
Well, yes, what else could I do?
I looked at him in disbelief at his bewildered expression. And a grim realisation was forming in my mind. No, surely not that poor girl, that poor child. I had to know. Let me get this straight. All this time you've been seeing her, limping about as you say, and it never occurred to you. My voice just trailed off. I waffled on. He was just staring at me blankly, and I had to fight the urge to hit him. Instead, I hauled him up to his feet. Get your coat. I pray to God I am wrong about this. I virtually dragged my uncle back to the now empty, silent church. I took out the crowbar which I had brought from the tool shed, grabbed a lit candelabra and led the way down the crypt stairs, and I had my uncle trailing down the stairs behind me like a reluctant child. Where did it happen? He pointed to the far corner without saying a word. I approached a large black ledger stone near the wall. I glanced back at my uncle and he nodded. Heart in my mouth, with much grunting and effort, I managed to lift and slide the stone to one side. I lowered the candelabra. The interior was now illuminated. Tears started to well up in my eyes. Then I heard a wail of anguish by my ear like an animal in pain, which nearly made me pitch forward.
I thought she was dead. I thought she was dead. Oh, God Christ in heaven, I did not know.
His words slid into guttural moans as my uncle, who had peered over my shoulder, slid to the floor, arms clasped about his knees, his body rocking. Below me in the stone tomb was a corpse which was curled up in one corner. I could see one of its legs was twisted, unnaturally tangled in a chain. I could make out the corpse's face was frozen in a silent scream. As tears streamed down my face, I could not decide what was more horrifically devastating. Was it the fact that this girl had still been alive with just a badly broken leg when entombed? Or was it the collection of tiny, almost bird-like skeletal bones that lay cradled in her pelvis? She gave birth in this hell. I will always forever hate myself for even thinking that this poor maid gave birth in this dark tomb. And in order to survive, did she do something so terrible that I can't even bring myself to say it? Christmas is a magical time for kids. Most parents do their utmost to maintain the magic and wonder for their children. My parents were no different. They worked so hard to make every Christmas an experience we would never forget. Dad was always trying to outdo the last Christmas. He finally topped them all to such a degree I can hardly even remember any of the Christmases before. It's funny how I remember that one, the bad Christmas. But I don't remember all the others, which are all so blurry, faded and fractured. Apparently I loved Christmas. We all loved Christmas in my family, but I'm told that I especially loved it. On Boxing Day I would already be babbling on about how the next Christmas will be bigger and better, and all the kids would be jealous when they saw how many toys I got. My brother James told me that Dad would tell me to live in the moment and enjoy today. Who was Dad kidding, he had said. I saw that faraway look in Dad's eyes as he plotted and planned for the next bigger, better Christmas. Oh yeah, Dad indulged us kids, my brother and I. We wanted for nothing. Mum would caution him not to spoil us, but Dad never listened. He was always bringing us something or other home. Well, that's what my mum tells me. I barely remember the gifts he bought us anyway. The truth is, I barely remember my father. Those happy times, opening presents around the tree at Christmas, eating, laughing, playing, are muted shadows now. Because of that bad one, that bad Christmas supersedes them all. It was as if it had cast a long shadow on all the others. I tried to look beyond that nightmare, over it, under it and around it, but those wonderful times my family would tell me about are cloaked in a foggy haze. The worst of it all, behind that haze stands my father. I don't remember him, his essence, his vibrancy that I'm told so much about. When I look at photographs, I just see a man that I don't know. He is just a ghost, a hazy figure that moves in and out of my memories and dreams, but never fully in focus. I tried so hard to replace the hazy figure in my memories with his kindly, robust face, but I stopped doing that after a while, because when I did, he would within seconds fade and crumble into something so horrific. It would take me hours to shake it from my head. So no, the shadow hazy figure was safer, for sanity's sake at least. I'm a grown man now, and no matter how often my family try to jog my memory, I just don't remember. They tell me about all the great times with Dad, just amazing things we did together, but I just can't recall, and I tell them I can't. I don't feel them. I don't remember them. It is as if they happened to someone else, another family, not me, not mine. I may not remember the Christmases prior, but I do remember every little detail of that fateful one. I remember it being unusually cold, and I remember the snow covering everything in a white blanket. I remember the snowman my brother and I made. We called him Humphrey. He stood right outside our bay window where I could see him from the warmth of our living room. His stick arms wide and welcoming, with his carrot nose and little black stone eyes, stark against his white frozen face, winking at me. If the moon was out at night, I could still see him out there in the cold, and he always looked bigger at night and a little frightening, if I'm honest. The build up to Christmas Day was exciting and fun, and my mother was cooking on Christmas Eve, the dash to the shops to pick up the stuff she had forgotten, the car whooshing through the snow as we raced home so she could put the turkey on, and the tree was so big and bright that year. It was glorious. I can see the stars sitting on top of that tree, the angels, the fake snow, fairy lights and tinsel, and of course my mind's eye is drawn to the presents under that tree. There's so many I couldn't count them. My dad, bless him, had decided to work extra hours that Christmas Eve so he would not be home till late. I had heard my mother gently berating him that morning. "You're working way too many hours," she had said. I know, but I just want to make sure this is the Christmas to top all the others, and I can't do that without money, can I?" I remember watching them both at the doorway as Mum wrapped his scarf snugly around his neck. "The kids would love you without all of this, John," Mum would say. "I just want them to have everything that I didn't have as a child, you know," he replied. He'd kiss my mother on the cheek, open the front door, and I see him standing there for a moment as a flurry of snow and wind encases his silhouette, and then he is gone. I shivered. It was bitterly cold, and I ran back to the warmth of my bed. Oh, that gorgeous smell of cooking that evening, and I could hear my mother and Aunt Judy chatting away in animated tones in the kitchen. I guess I was a quiet kid and loved nothing better than to sit and read my comics. My brother James was the complete opposite of me, a raucous child, never stopped running around. He was one of those kids that was only quiet when he slept or playing one of his computer games. If James was quiet and out of sight any other time, then we all panicked because he was sure to be up to no good. I was 3 years older than James, and it fell to me to watch him when my parents were busy. Like now, Mum's chatting and cooking in the kitchen and Dad's late at work. Thankfully, James was winding down and would any minute go into sleep mode. I prayed he would. I looked at the clock that sat over our fireplace, and I remember clearly it was 8 p.m. and then 9 p.m. I was sure Dad should be home by now. My mother had carted a protesting James off to bed and waved my aunt goodbye. "Are you ready for bed, love?" she would ask me. "Dad's not home," I said, looking mournfully at the clock. "Can I wait up for him?" "Don't worry, sweetheart, he's working late tonight. He'll wake you up tomorrow morning with a big ho ho ho," Mum had laughed. But Dad didn't return that night, and he didn't return the next day or any day after that. The police were called in and they took photos and details and so many questions. It was such a muddle of events during those first few weeks. Concerned relatives, colleagues and friends turned up, police in and out, Mum's crying quietly as she listened hopelessly to the detective's summations, speculations and assumptions. Dad's colleagues had reported seeing him at work that day. They seen him arrive, seen him throughout the day, and they saw him leave early. He had been his usual cheerful self, nothing out of the ordinary. He was excited about Christmas, they had said. The only unusual thing that had been uncovered was that he didn't work late that night. 2 days after my dad disappeared, the police found his car a few streets away. The clothes he had worn the day of his disappearance were neatly folded on the back seat. Eventually, they concluded that there was no foul play, and I had heard them quietly telling my sobbing mum that it was that season, that time of year, stressful for so many people. The suicide rate would go up, and sometimes some people just walk away from it all. But they said they would continue with their inquiries. My mum just nodded along meekly, too exhausted to protest the humiliating prospect that my dad had actually walked. I remember the police officer's words just collided into each other in my 10-year-old head as I ran to my room with tears streaming down my face. I remember that was the day the nightmares began. I call them nightmares because the alternative is just too horrifying to contemplate. I remember going to bed that night and falling asleep to the sound of my little brother's rhythmic breathing. He seemed to be getting past Dad's disappearance pretty well. It was as if he didn't understand that Dad was gone. In my dream, I heard slow, shuffling footsteps out in the hallway that stopped at my bedroom door. Then I would hear my name being called in a low voice. It seemed as if whatever it was waiting for me to answer. Then the door to my bedroom would creak open, and the cold air that preceded it was deathly. The footsteps drew closer to my bed, and I would squeeze my eyes tightly shut, willing whatever it was to go away. David! It rasped and cracked as if breaking ice, and I would feel a rush of cold air on my cheek. I knew whatever it was leaning close to my face, peering at me, staring at me, and then I would scream, "Go away!" in my dream and pull my blanket over my face. David! It would rasp again, voice fading as my mother's footsteps could be heard quickly approaching my room. Those dreams continued every night and never deviated. It would always end with me screaming, it departing, and my mother racing into my room to console me. I was even hauled off to the doctors and he said it would pass in time, but it didn't. Well, not for many months anyway. Over time and with much analysis, I developed a sneaking, crawling suspicion that it was Humphrey, and I would stare at him accusingly from the window. Sometimes I think I could see him move, and other times his black stone eyes would twinkle just that little bit brighter, and I could have sworn he winked at me. My suspicions grew with each passing night. It was Humphrey who brought the cold into my room. I became obsessed, I became fixated on the idea, and naturally an aversion and hatred for the snowman just took over, and just when I thought he was melting and seemed to be about to crumble away, it would snow again and James would resurrect my tormentor with much love and dedication. I remember early one morning after one of my night terrors, I had rushed out into the garden, grabbed a shovel and smashed Humphrey over the head, watching with great satisfaction as his frozen head caved in on itself. By the time I had finished, Humphrey had returned to just a pile of snow. I crushed his stick arms with the edge of the shovel, and when I spied one of his winking eyes, I kicked it across the garden, watching it disappear into the distance with great satisfaction. I stood there for a moment, staring at my handiwork, happy in the knowledge that I'd finally worked up the courage to rid myself of my nemesis. As I turned back to the house, I saw James peeping at me from our bedroom window. I'll never forget the look of horror on his small face and the tears welling up in his eyes. I heard him crying under his duvet as I returned to our bedroom, and I heard him mutter, "Murderer." But the nightmares continued for me because apparently Humphrey was much more than just a pile of snow. Humphrey didn't need form or fashion to pursue me, and it seemed I would never be rid of him. One cold February evening, my brother turned to me out of the blue and said, "Why don't you just say hi, stop hiding? Open your eyes, ask it what it wants." Then he just shrugged and turned back to watch the TV. His suggestion was unexpected and threw me for a moment. He obviously had been thinking about asking me and decided that it was the best course of action. Thankfully, he had moved on from the early morning dispatch of Humphrey, and he'd forgiven me when I eventually explained my suspicions. "It's a dream," I replied. "I can't control my dreams, can I?" So James had said his bit and was hardly interested in a full-blown conversation. He had already hightailed it out of the room, probably up to his new bedroom. Mum had moved him into the spare room so I wouldn't disturb him with my nightly terrors. I thought about what James said that evening, and I continued to think about it as I got ready for bed, and I thought about it as I pulled my blanket up to my chin, knowing that my nightly visitor would inevitably appear and the nightly ritual would play over, but this time it would be different because I was going to take my little brother's advice. I was going to confront Humphrey, that thing that had tormented me night after night. If I could will myself in my dream to confront it, ask it what it wants, and at some point my thoughts faded into sleep. In my dream I heard the same slow, painful shuffle towards my bedroom door. The whisper as it called me. The door creaking open and the tortured footsteps towards my bed. When I felt its cold breath, I opened my scrunched up eyes, but the words froze in my throat as the bloated, corrupted face peered at me and whispered my name. It was whiter than Humphrey and colder than Humphrey could ever have been. Its eyes were lifeless and its lips cracked and shriveled, its breath so cold against my skin. So horrific was this sight that my mind refuted what I was seeing and turned in on itself, retreating to the safety of darkness and enveloping me in the same. I screamed at the top of my lungs. Nobody, let alone a child, should see the corrupted, decaying face of a parent. "My father's dead, my father's dead, my father's dead," I said as my mum came rushing into the room. She consoled me, telling me it's just a dream, and she hugged me so close. "It wasn't a dream, Mum, it was Dad. It was always Dad, and he's dead," I whispered between sobs. That's all Mum could get out of me for days. My nightly visitor continued to torment me night after night, but I never confronted it again. As soon as I heard it at my door, I would turn on my side and face the wall, eyes tightly shut. I didn't scream or shout anymore, I just ignored it till it went away. The dreams, as I like to call them now, persisted into early spring, and that was when a horrible smell invaded the house. "Smells like a rat that died in the walls," my aunt suggested. "I don't need this," my mum kept muttering to herself as she called in the exterminators. My poor mum was a shadow of her former self and had lost so much weight. I wandered around outside, tired and weary, too weary for a child of my age. I sat on the swing and watched as the exterminator arrived and searched the house with my mother. The exterminator guy eventually came out to the garden with a puzzled look on his face, and I watched as he rubbed the stubble on his chin as he slowly backed away from the house, looking up at our chimney. I just sat there and watched as the fire brigade arrived, and then the police, and then an ambulance turned up. And I watched as they brought my father's bloated body down the ladder. They must have all forgotten about me with all that was transpiring. I just sat there swinging back and forth slowly as I watched them lay his body on the gurney. Dad was dressed in a Santa Claus outfit that was no longer a cheerful cherry red, but now it was a frazzled, sooty black. The once white stick-on beard now a grimy, matted mess. Dad's skin was blackened, but his eyes were the most horrible, lifeless, milky, glazed eyes, just as I had seen them in my nightmare. They covered him up and wheeled him away. My mother was unusually calm as she listened to the officer's attempt at an explanation. One of them was holding a big transparent evidence bag, and in that bag was a bright red Santa sack. We think he may have had a heart attack while attempting to come through the chimney. We won't know definitively, of course, until after the autopsy. I saw him hand the evidence bag to Mum. "Christmas gifts for you all, I believe. Very tragic. I'm so sorry for your loss." Mum thanked him and clutched the bag tightly to her chest. As the guy walked away from Mum, he turned back and said, All the gifts are in pristine condition, which is surprising considering the elements got to everything else. I've still got those last gifts from my father, and I haven't taken them out, and they're still in the red Santa sack in a cupboard somewhere. I wasn't ready to open them then, and I am still not ready, and maybe I never will be. I just keep thinking about my dad stuck in the chimney all Christmas just above our heads, frozen solid like a popsicle. I feel so much guilt about so many things, and maybe if I hadn't been so greedy and wanted bigger, better Christmases, Dad wouldn't have had a heart attack working so many long hours. And those horrible dreams I had, I know Dad was trying to tell me where he was. All those months, and I was too scared to just listen. My story is done now, and I guess there's only one thing left to say. I'm sorry, Humphrey. My mother passed away when I was young, too young to remember much of her in fact, and all that's left is a fragment of a person, a ghost, who stalks the lonely corners of my mind. Still, I remember enough to know that her death hit me hard. I couldn't sleep, I wouldn't eat, and I would cry at the smallest thing that reminded me of her. So after a few visits to a child psychologist, my father decided that a change of scenery was in order. He bought an old house out in the country and we moved in a few months after. The next few years were a blessing. We would take long walks up to the mountains and fish in a nearby stream, far away from any real city. It didn't last for long though. Like every child, I grew up. I finished school, moved away to university, landed a decent job, met a nice girl, and even had a few kids along the way. My father and I talked less and less over the years, and life does that to you. The only times I would see him were during the holidays, where he was always quiet and reserved. He was always a man of little words, but I could tell he was getting lonely. He died last month and he was 78 years old. Over the last few days I've been staying at our old house to clean out his things. When I was young the house was always in perfect working order, which is a sign of a military man. But over the last few years he had really let the place go downhill. There were mounds of papers and books stacked high to the ceilings and dirty pots and pans strewn about the kitchen. The smell was thick and monstrous, the kind that sticks to the back of your throat and you'd give anything to scrape it off. After some thought I decided to leave it until the morning. It was late and I was anxious to get some sleep after the long drive. I retreated to my old room and found it exactly as I had left it all those years ago. From the posters of half-naked women on the wall to the old gaming system tucked away under the TV. It was untouched. The room was frozen in time, save for one thing that I just didn't remember. A journal left under the bed. It was small and made of leather with worn edges from what looked like years of heavy abuse. It was wrapped in a thin black string to keep the pages from falling out. Inside, the pages were yellowed with scratch writing detailing memories that I had no recollection of ever happening. I matched the writing from this journal with a card I had written to my father for his birthday one year. It was obvious the journal definitely belonged to me, but I wish it didn't. Journal date 02/07/1973. Today I met a man who lives at the bottom of the garden. I told him about Mum and he said he was sorry. He was lovely and gave me a book for me to write in when I get lonely. He said I should keep it under my bed so Dad doesn't find it and it would be our little secret. He was funny and made me laugh and then he went back into the hole. I hope I see him again. 04/07/1973. I saw the man again today. He didn't stop to say hello like last time, but when I saw his head pop out from his hole, he waved at me and went back down again. 05/07/1973. The old man told me his name was Herman and that he had lived in his hole for a long, long time. I showed some of the drawings I had done for him in my book and he said that he really liked them. He said I could come into his hole and play with his little boy and that we could be friends. I really wanted to, but Dad called me in for dinner so I couldn't. Even reading these first few entries made me feel sick to my stomach. Was there really a man who lived at the bottom of the garden? It's impossible. I've been around enough kids to know how wild their imaginations can be, and my own youngest still believes that monsters live under his bed. I brushed it off and I just went to bed. I was so restless during the night, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the thought that what I read in that journal might be all true. So at first daylight I headed into the garden. Trying to get to the bottom of the garden was a tall order. The grass was knee-high, and fallen branches from the old oak trees that lined the edges blocked my path with every twist and turn. I noticed spiders crawled across the leaves of the overgrown bushes and made their webs across the branches of the trees. There was a small hole in the back fence. It was too small for me to fit through, so I snapped the edges with a few swift kicks and crawled through the splintered gap. The hole was on the other side. It was about 2 feet in diameter, and grass hung over the edges and fell into the empty space. Bones of small animals lay about the entrance like gifts under a Christmas tree. The bones belonged to cats, rabbits, rats, mice, and God knows what else. I peered down into the hole and saw nothing but a deep, dark abyss. I covered it with wood from the fence and retreated into the house, where I sat and read a few more of the journal entries. One entry that I found sent a shiver through my bones. 09/07/1973. Herman came up to my window last night to wake me up. He said that I could come back with him to play with his little boy. But I said I didn't want to because it was too dark, and he got angry with me, then told me that he didn't like me anymore. He said that if I let him play with my mouse Benji, we would still be friends again, and that I should come in the morning to give him Benji. So I went out before Dad was up and put Benji by the hole. Herman came out and ate it and said thank you. I ran into the house because I was scared, and now I don't want him to be my friend anymore. I told Dad that Benji ran away when I took him outside, and he was mad. I miss Benji. That night I lay awake reading through the journal. Herman never appeared again after that day, apart from a few occasions where I thought I saw him from my window. Then the journal stopped. The last entry was dated only a week after he had eaten the mouse. I had a vague memory of Benji, but as far as I was aware, he had escaped one day in the garden. Even if these stories were not true, it seemed concerning to me that such a young mind could come up with something so disturbing. After I couldn't stay awake any longer, I lay on the pillow and fell asleep. I woke up to a faint sound below the rusting wind. I jumped up and stared at the source of the noise. It came from the window behind the curtains. I stood up, crept closer, ready to pull back the curtains. I stretched out my hand and felt the cloth on my fingertips. I fell to the floor and scurried to the corner of the room. I grabbed for the heaviest thing I could find, a cricket bat, and I held it ready above my head. The window screeched open, causing the wind to flood into the room. The curtains whirled and loose pages from the journal danced through the air like birds in a storm. I could see the silhouette of a scrawny hand and wrist through the curtains. It looked to belong to a member of the dead, and then the window slammed shut and the storm died down with it. The pages from the journal fluttered back to the floor and the curtains lay swinging from side to side. I slowly approached and opened the curtains with care, where I found something left upon the windowsill. A letter. It was crumpled and smeared with dirt. I noticed it had today's date scrawled across the top. I found myself reading the letter out loud. Dear Thomas, I hope you remember me. I certainly remember you. It's been over 40 years since we last met, but I had no trouble in recognising you. You always had a distinctive face, but I hope you're still not too sad about what happened to poor old Benji. He tasted very good and you kept him nice and plump for me. I've been waiting for you to come back for longer than you know. Your father certainly didn't realise. I've been watching him over the years, and I must say, Thomas, he's been ever so lonely. Whatever did you do? I thought more highly of you, Thomas. You used to be such a kind boy who always looked out for those forced to suffer alone. Your father didn't take too kindly to my telling him about the journal hidden under your bed. In fact, I saw him cry from the window while he was reading it. He was such a sad soul, so I helped him feel at ease. It didn't take long. And you're here now as well, so you shouldn't feel too upset. I hope we see each other some more soon. Love, Herman. Like other kids, when I was young, I always had a fear of my dad. That fear that if I screw up, I knew I'd be in big trouble. He would use a belt or even his hands. Look, it wasn't anything too serious. I guess my dad was just giving me some of that tough love. He would still show affection though. He would take me and my sister to Disney or find me some neat gifts like a new bike. And I noticed things started changing as I got older. He gave less advice, and his distance from me made me feel more insecure. And he would treat my sister much worse. I remember he started cheating on my mum with younger women at his work and basically became your typical idea of a douchebag cop. At the time I thought he was going through some kind of midlife crisis, but you know what, he just seemed to be getting worse. As a senior in high school, I had a girlfriend that we needed to help out and get her away from her abusive home, so we let her stay with us for a bit. And you know what, it was the first time I've seen my dad being helpful in forever. Things actually felt a little better with my girlfriend around. She was a great distraction for me at the time, but she already graduated a year before me, so she stayed at home while I was at school. So everything was wonderful until I got a text from my sister freaking out that I shouldn't get mad and that she's sorry. I hadn't a clue what the text was about, and when I got home my sister was in the living room with my dad and my girlfriend. And then they told me the truth. And the truth was that throughout the past couple of months, while my girlfriend was living with us, she had been sleeping with my dad. I just lost it and blacked out, and my sister had to stop me from killing my dad. I wanted my dad dead. He crossed the line, but my sister would not let me touch him. You know what? He then forced me to keep the secret from Mum with threats until he could tell her himself. Mum wasn't stupid. She already knew he was seeing some girl behind her back, and unfortunately she became really depressed. Mum's drinking got worse and worse, and her new car really shows the damage that was done by her drinking. And you know what? Then the three of them decided to text Mum about what was going on, and they all left before Mum returned home. And when Mum got home, she held me, apologising. But I was numb. I was no longer myself. I lost a part of myself and continued blacking out and getting more and more violent. I eventually was hospitalised because of this growing problem. They gave me some medications to help, and it worked for a while, and after doing some research, I found out that my dad was the same way, except he never went to the hospital. I heard stories about how he would black out and do horrible things. It started years ago on the night my dad's mother made him clean brains off the wall when a guy committed suicide. Dad wasn't the same after that. My dad would get into fights with no memory of it. He would fight to the death if he wasn't stopped. There was a time when my mum broke up with him when they were teens. Dad got a dog. He named the dog after my mum and shot the dog between the eyes. Eventually my mum helped and supported him out of it for a bit and said that he seemed to have changed after I was born. So then I followed the story on my dad's side of the family by seeing why my dad is such a psycho and why it seems that I am following suit. I tracked down my dad's mum, who he hasn't talked to in almost 20 years. She sat me down and explained how it was her fault. It's a curse that she caused. She had me drive further out to where they lived years ago. There was a cabin deep into the woods. I walked in it and it was like a horror movie. There was dried blood that ran down the walls. A large, dried up blood spot on the floor. Black candles lying down everywhere, knives and really creepy paintings. The air inside the cabin was thick and musty. It had a nasty sulphuric smell and I just wanted out. My dad's mother explained that when she was young she was into all kinds of drugs and it really screwed up her brain. And eventually some of the kids she hung out with that did the same stuff introduced her to a cult that worshipped evil spirits and demons. 4 decades ago on Christmas Day night, she along with her friends decided to summon a demon. It was something they have never done before and they all went ahead and started it. They summoned a creature that they described as something so horrifying that they were unable to describe it with any words. But the creature just vanished. But my dad's mother's stomach was swollen, and she told him that her water broke, but she was not even pregnant when they began. Later that Christmas night, my dad was born. So far, all I've learned is my dad and ultimately me have a demonic connection. I don't know if it means my dad was spawned by a demon or if he was born through his mum as a human, but whatever happens seems to affect me as well.